It was the sweet potatoes that I remember most clearly. They were in the ceramic dish my mother had used every Thanksgiving for as long as I could recall. The oval one with the small chip on the left handle that had been there since I was 9 years old. They had been sitting untouched for 11 minutes by the time my uncle finished his sentence, and by the time the room processed what he had said, they were cold. He had not intended it as a grenade. That much I can say with reasonable confidence. He was the kind of man who filled conversational silences with whatever happened to be in his head, and what happened to be in his head that afternoon was something he had seen. A property transfer record, a business registration, something that had surfaced in the particular way that public filings surface when someone is paying casual attention to county records. He said it the way people say things they believe are common knowledge. "I didn't realize you'd done so well for yourself. Saw something about a filing. Looks like you're sitting on quite a bit." That was all he said. It was enough. I was watching my sister's face when the sentence landed. I had developed the habit of watching her face over many years, the way you develop any skill that keeps you safe. Quietly, through repetition, without announcing it. I saw the exact moment the information reached her. It was not surprise, it was recalibration. What followed took 4 minutes. I know because I was tracking time the way I track most things in that family's presence. Carefully, and for the record. My sister spoke first, then my mother, then my aunt, who had arrived late and was still in her coat. The specific figure, $12 million, which my uncle had not actually stated but which emerged from the conversation the way these things do, through inference and escalation, was on the table before the 4th minute was finished. And with it, a sentence delivered by my mother in the tone she reserved for things she considered self-evident. "She deserves it more than you do. You know that." The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. My father looked at the tablecloth. He is a man who has always expressed his discomfort through the careful study of nearby surfaces, and the tablecloth held his attention for the remainder of the meal. I did not respond. I picked up my fork. I ate what was on my plate. I noted, with the detached precision that has served me well in that family's presence, that no one at the table had asked me a single question about what I had built or how I had built it in the 11 years since I had left that house at 24 with 2 suitcases and a savings account containing $3,200. In 4 minutes, they had decided what to do with it. What my family did not understand, what none of them had paused long enough to consider, was that the $12 million they were dividing at that table had a legal architecture built around it that they were not going to enjoy learning about. The sweet potatoes were completely cold by the time anyone thought to pass them. There is an obvious question underneath everything I just described, and I want to answer it directly. How does a person accumulate $12 million quietly enough that her own family has no idea, and then sit at a Thanksgiving table while that family attempts to redistribute it, and feel nothing more urgent than mild clinical interest? The answer is not a personality trait. It is a timeline. I had been building in complete and deliberate silence for 11 years. Not quickly, not through a single event or a fortunate accident, through a sequence of specific decisions made consistently over a period long enough that the results became genuinely invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. And my family, I had learned early, was not paying close attention to me. They were paying attention to my sister. That dynamic, as it turned out, was one of the most useful conditions I ever worked with. What my family saw at that Thanksgiving table was a number. What they didn't see was the 11 years of decisions, structures, and legal frameworks I had built around it, and what it was going to cost them to find out those structures existed. I'm going to take you through all of it. How the wealth was built, how the family dynamic made silence the only rational strategy available to me, and what happened when a single careless sentence at a holiday table forced everything into the open at once. One piece of context worth establishing before we go further. The Federal Reserve's 2022 Survey of Consumer Finances found that a net worth of $12 million places a household at approximately the top 1% of wealth in the United States, a threshold sitting at roughly $11.64 million. The number that shocked my family at that table is a number most Americans will never reach. That gap is exactly why the conversation went the way it did. I was 24 years old when I left that house, and I had $3,200 in a savings account and a salary offer for $41,000 a year in a field my family found difficult to explain at dinner parties. My mother described what I did to relatives as something with data, which was accurate enough and enthusiastic enough that I never corrected her. That was year one. And year one is where both timelines begin, mine and the family's, running parallel to each other for the next 11 years without anyone in that house fully understanding that both were in motion simultaneously. My timeline was simple in its logic, if not always in its execution. I lived on approximately 58% of my net income from the first month of that first job. Not because I was depriving myself of anything essential, but because I had done the arithmetic and understood that the gap between what I earned and what I spent was the only variable I could control with any reliability. The remainder went into a brokerage account I had opened before my first paycheck cleared. I did not do anything sophisticated with it. I selected a low-cost index strategy I had spent 4 months researching before executing, and I did not deviate from it regardless of what the market did in any given quarter. In year 3, I made my first real estate acquisition, a 2-unit residential property purchased for $187,000 in a market I had been tracking for 18 months. The down payment was $37,400, saved specifically and exclusively for that purpose. By year 4, it was generating $1,340 in monthly net rental income. I did not celebrate this. I reinvested it. I was not born with capital. I did not receive an inheritance. I did not have a benefactor or a fortunate accident or a single moment of insight that changed everything. I had a spreadsheet, a savings rate, and enough years to let both work. Now, the family's timeline. My sister is 2 years younger than me, and she has always been the family's identified center of gravity. I do not mean this unkindly. It is simply an accurate description of a dynamic that was established long before either of us was old enough to name it. Her difficulties were the family's emergencies. Her instability was always described as temporary, always cushioned, always someone else's problem to absorb until things improved. Things improved periodically and briefly, and then required cushioning again. In year 2 of my timeline, my parents co-signed a lease for my sister's apartment. She defaulted on it within 7 months. My parents absorbed the financial consequence without discussion. In year 5, the family extended what was described as a loan of $14,000 to cover a combination of overdue bills and a relocation my sister had decided on with 3 weeks' notice. The loan was never repaid. It was never formally forgiven either. It simply stopped being referenced, the way these things do when a family collectively decides that acknowledgement is more painful than silence. In year 7, my sister identified a business opportunity. The family funded it, collectively, enthusiastically, and to the tune of $22,000. The business closed within 8 months. The $22,000 was not discussed again. I contributed to none of these transfers after year 1, when I had given $800 toward my sister's first security deposit and understood, with reasonable clarity, that the transaction would establish a precedent I was not prepared to honor indefinitely. I declined subsequent requests quietly and without extended explanation. I did not lecture anyone. I did not issue ultimatums. I simply said no and held it. The family's response to that boundary accumulated slowly, the way these narratives always do. I became selfish. Then I became cold. Then I had always been like that, which is the final form these characterizations take when they need to feel inevitable rather than constructed. The specific language used against me over 11 years was not creative, but it was consistent. Family helps family. You have more than you need. Your sister is struggling and you're not doing anything. That last sentence was deployed with particular frequency in years 6 through 9, during which my sister's financial instability reached its most sustained period, and the family's appetite for external contribution was at its highest. A peer-reviewed study published in the journal Aging Clinical and Experimental Research found that family asset dynamics frequently shift from altruism toward control when one member accumulates significantly more than others. and that perceived unfairness in distribution is a documented predictor of both conflict and severed relationships. I did not read that study until much later, but I had been living inside its findings for the better part of a decade. In year 10, my net worth crossed a threshold I had been working toward since year 3. I did the calculation on a Tuesday evening, alone, at the desk in my home office. I closed the spreadsheet. I made dinner. I did not tell anyone. I had learned by then that information shared inside that particular family was not processed as information. It was processed as inventory. And I had no interest in being inventoried. There is a difference between wealth and protected wealth. I want to explain that distinction carefully because it is the difference that made everything that happened after Thanksgiving functionally irrelevant as a financial threat. What I built over 11 years was not simply a number. It was a number inside a structure, and the structure was the point. In year 1, I was earning $41,000 annually and saving 42% of my net income without exception. Not approximately 42%. Not 42% in the months when it was convenient. Every month, the same percentage, moved to a separate account before I had the opportunity to make different decisions with it. By the end of year 1, I had accumulated $11,200 in liquid capital. In year 2, I opened a brokerage account and deployed that capital into a low-cost index strategy I had spent 4 months researching before I executed a single transaction. I did not attempt to time anything. I did not chase performance. I selected a methodology and applied it consistently, which is considerably less interesting than most financial narratives, but considerably more effective over a decade. Year 3 was the decision that changed the trajectory. I purchased a 2-unit residential property for $187,000 in a market I had been tracking for 18 months. The down payment was $37,400. Saved specifically for that purpose in a separate account I had labeled internally as non-negotiable. By year 4, the property was generating $1,340 in monthly net rental income after expenses. I did not spend that income. I redirected it. By the close of year 5, my net worth had reached approximately $310,000. I had not told a single person, not a friend, not a colleague, no one in my family. The numbers do not require dramatization. 11 years of consistent behavior at a 42% savings rate, with real estate appreciation and compounded investment returns, produces results that feel surprising only if you have not been watching them accumulate in a spreadsheet for a decade. In year 6, I left salaried employment and established a single-member LLC, through which I conducted all consulting work. The decision was practical, not symbolic. A sole proprietorship offers no meaningful separation between personal and business finances. An LLC, structured correctly, does. I retained a business attorney to draft the operating agreement at a flat fee of $1,800, and I was specific about what I needed it to contain. 3 provisions in particular would later matter considerably. The first was an asset protection clause that structured all business income and receivables within the LLC's umbrella, legally separate from my personal balance sheet. The second was a partnership and investment provision, specifying that any third-party claim on the LLC's assets or income required written consent from all relevant parties before it could be considered valid. A clause designed specifically to prevent informal arrangements from carrying legal weight. The third was a personal property schedule, attached as an exhibit to the operating agreement, listing all assets I held individually and outside the LLC's structure, with acquisition dates and estimated valuations. That schedule was updated annually. By year 8, I had acquired 2 additional properties. My real estate portfolio now comprised 3 units, with a combined estimated market value of $680,000, against $290,000 in remaining mortgage obligations. A net real estate equity position of approximately $390,000. My investment portfolio had grown to roughly $1.4 million. My consulting LLC was generating $210,000 annually in revenue. I was driving the same vehicle I had purchased in year 4. My lifestyle had not changed in any way that was visible to anyone observing from the outside. That was not accidental. Visibility is a variable. I had chosen to manage it. This is the layer that made the Thanksgiving confrontation what it actually was. noise in the vicinity of a structure it could not reach. As my net worth approached $12 million in year 10, driven primarily by the appreciated value of my real estate holdings and 11 years of uninterrupted compounding, I retained two professionals I had not previously needed: an estate planning attorney with specific experience in high net worth asset protection, and a financial advisor whose practice focused exclusively on clients above the $5 million threshold. Over the following 14 months, those engagements produced three things. The first was a revocable living trust into which my primary assets were transferred. The trust's successor trustee provisions were structured to require no family consent at any stage of administration. The second was a formal gift policy document, drafted by my estate attorney and filed in my legal record, specifying that any financial transfer to any family member required a written request submitted in advance, a written agreement signed by both parties, and independent legal review before any funds moved. The document contained one sentence I had asked to be included verbatim. No verbal request, regardless of the circumstances under which it was made, would be treated as binding or as establishing any expectation of compliance. The third was a documentation binder. 140 pages organized by asset class, current valuations, acquisition dates, ownership structures. Held in two encrypted digital locations and one physical location maintained by my attorney. When my sister said at that Thanksgiving table that I had $12 million and that she deserved it, she was describing a number she had somehow learned. She had no idea what was built around it. Let me return you to the table. Now, what was underneath the surface of that room? You know the savings rate and the property acquisition and the LLC and the trust and the 140-page binder sitting in my attorney's office. You know the 11 years. So let me tell you what I saw when I looked around that table during those 4 minutes. Not as a wounded family member, but as someone who had been documenting a pattern long enough to recognize its final form. My sister is across from me. This is the same person whose $14,000 loan exists in my memory as a specific line item. Year 5, never repaid, never formally forgiven, simply absorbed into the family's collective accounting of things we do not discuss. The same person whose business the family funded to the sum of $22,000 in year 7, which returned nothing and was also not discussed after it closed. She is now sitting across a Thanksgiving table constructing a moral argument about what she deserves. I note this without anger. It is simply the pattern, presenting itself again at a larger scale. My mother is at the head of the table. She is the person who originated the phrase, "You have more than you need," and deployed it with such consistency over so many years that it had ceased to function as a sentence and had become something closer to weather, ambient, expected, not worth arguing with. She is also the person who, in this moment, is providing the demand with its emotional architecture. Without her, it is my sister's grievance. With her, it becomes a family position. My aunt is to my mother's left. 4 years earlier, at a different gathering, she had used the word selfish to describe my decision not to contribute to a financial rescue I had not been consulted about before being asked to fund. She had said it conversationally, the way people say things they believe are consensus opinions. I had not responded then either. What none of them know, sitting at that table, the number they are referencing lives inside a revocable trust. The gift policy document exists, filed and dated, in my attorney's records. Every asset has a documented ownership structure. Every financial decision I have made in 11 years has a paper trail that runs in one direction, toward me, legally and completely. The moment the conversation moves from implication to explicit demand comes when my mother places both hands flat on the table. It is a gesture I recognize. It means she has decided the conversation is now serious. This is a family matter, she says. Families share. I have heard that sentence, or a version of it, more times than I have kept count of. What is different this time is only the number attached to it. The sentence is identical. The structure is identical. The expectation that I will absorb the request and reshape my behavior around it is identical. It is not a new argument. It is the same argument scaled. I excuse myself from the table at 3:46 p.m. I walk to the kitchen. I sent one text message to my attorney at 3:47 p.m. It read, "It's happened. We'll need the full protocol." She responded with 2 words within 4 minutes. "Understood. Monday." I returned to the table. I finished my meal. I did not argue because there was nothing left to argue about. The documents already existed. The structure was already in place. Everything that needed to be decided had been decided, in writing, long before my uncle made his offhand comment about a property filing and my sister's expression shifted across the table. I had been waiting for this conversation for 11 years. I simply hadn't known it would happen over sweet potatoes. My family spent 10 days confirming everything I had already documented about them. My mother called 4 times in the first 48 hours. I did not answer. I did not send the calls to voicemail with any particular feeling. I simply noted each one in a running log I had started on Thanksgiving evening, with timestamps because documentation is a habit I had developed long before it became necessary in a legal context. My sister's approach was different. She sent text messages, which I also did not respond to and which I also logged. The messages began in a register of wounded expectation and moved, over the course of several days, into something more explicit. By day 6, she had used the phrase "legally entitled" in a text message, which told me 2 things: that she had spoken to someone who had given her incomplete information, and that the formal response could not wait past day 11. The family friend appeared on day 4, an email carefully worded suggesting that my silence was damaging the family and that a conversation, informal, without lawyers, would go a long way toward resolving what he described as a misunderstanding. I added his email to the log and did not reply. On day 11, my attorney sent a formal written response by certified mail to both my mother and my sister at their respective addresses. I had reviewed the final version the previous Friday and approved it without changes. It contained 5 enclosures, and I want to walk you through each one precisely, because precision is what the situation required and what the situation received. The first enclosure was a 1-page summary of my asset ownership structure. This was not a disclosure. I was not providing my family with an accounting of my finances. The document existed for one specific purpose: to demonstrate that the assets referenced at the Thanksgiving table were held inside a revocable living trust, and that the legal structure of that trust precluded any informal transfer of assets on the basis of verbal request, family expectation, or perceived moral entitlement. The summary identified the trust by name and referenced the date of its establishment. It contained no valuations. It contained no invitation to negotiate. The second enclosure was a copy of the gift policy document, the formal instrument I had filed with my attorney in year 11, specifying that any financial transfer to any family member required a written request submitted in advance, a written agreement executed by both parties, and independent legal review before any funds could move. The document's final clause was reproduced in bold typeface. No verbal request, regardless of the circumstances under which it was made, would be treated as binding or as establishing any expectation of compliance. The third enclosure was a letter from my estate planning attorney, signed and dated, confirming that the terms of the revocable trust were fully consistent with my expressed intentions, that those intentions had been documented over a period of 14 months through formal engagement, and that no external party held any claim, legal, equitable, or otherwise, on the trust's assets on the basis of familial relationship alone. The fourth enclosure was a 1-page research summary. A peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of Family Communication found that written estate plans are used specifically and deliberately to prevent inheritance disputes and to protect individuals from claims made after the fact. I did not include this to make a rhetorical point. I included it because my attorney and I had agreed that providing documented context for why the legal framework existed was more useful than leaving its purpose open to interpretation. The fifth enclosure was a formal written record of the $14,000 extended to my sister in year 5. Date of transfer, amount, terms as originally described. Current repayment status, 0. The document noted this history as relevant context, without elaboration. My sister called my personal number 31 minutes after the certified mail was delivered, according to the delivery confirmation. I watched the call come in. I let it go to voicemail. Later that evening, I listened to the message once, in its entirety, standing in my kitchen. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and made dinner. I did not return the call. I did not need to. Everything that required saying had already been delivered, in writing, by someone whose job it was to say it correctly. The formal response my attorney sent on day 11 was not the end of the process. It was the beginning of a different one. I want to be precise about what I did next because I think it is the part most people in this situation get wrong. The instinct, when a family makes a demand like the one made at that table, is to respond in kind. With anger, with counter-accusations, with a version of the same emotional escalation dressed in different language. I did not do that. I had spent 11 years building things that worked because they were structured correctly, and I saw no reason to abandon that approach at the moment it mattered most. I responded with a framework, specifically with two options, prepared with my attorney and delivered as a formal addendum to the Day 11 correspondence, giving my family 21 days to indicate in writing which path they wished to take. Option A was a formal family financial policy, a written document available for signature by any family member who wished to maintain any kind of financial relationship with me going forward. Its terms were straightforward. All requests for financial assistance of any kind must be submitted in writing, reviewed independently, and responded to within 30 days with either a written agreement or a written declination. No verbal requests, no requests made through intermediaries, no announcements at holiday tables. A process in place of a dynamic, documentation in place of expectation. Option B was a formally documented cessation of all financial engagement. No loans, no gifts, no co-signing of any instrument, no contribution to any collective family expense beyond my own proportional share of shared costs. If option B was elected, a written record confirming that the decision had been made voluntarily and without duress would be filed with my attorney and retained indefinitely. I am not asking anyone to apologize. I want to be clear about that because I have found that people expect an apology clause in situations like this one, as though the emotional acknowledgement is the point. It is not the point. An apology is a feeling. A signed document is a fact. I had spent enough years operating inside a family system built on feelings that were never converted into facts to understand the distinction with considerable precision. Regardless of which option was chosen, 3 written rules would govern all future personal engagement. I had drafted them myself over 2 evenings and reviewed them with my attorney before they were finalized. Rule 1. Financial topics of any kind may not be raised at family gatherings. Any request must be submitted through the written process specified in option A, or it must be acknowledged by the person making it as entirely outside the framework, and therefore without any expectation of response. Rule 2. My net worth, my asset structure, my investment decisions, and my financial history may not be discussed, referenced, estimated, or speculated about in any family communication, verbal, written, or otherwise. Rule 3. Any family member who violates either of the first 2 rules in a written or recorded medium will be treated as having elected option B by conduct, regardless of which option they had previously indicated. The American Psychological Association found in survey data that 22% of Americans anticipate or experience family conflict during the holiday season, and that financial stress is consistently among the most common accelerants of that conflict. I did not include that finding in my framework documentation out of grievance. I included it because it illustrates something structural. The conversation that happened at that Thanksgiving table was not an anomaly. It is a pattern that repeats in households across the country, with enough regularity that major psychological institutions track it annually. The framework I built is designed to make sure that pattern cannot repeat itself in my specific vicinity. 3 weeks after the attorney's letter was delivered, my mother called. It was a brief conversation, managed carefully on my end. Near the end of it, she asked me, in a tone I recognized as genuinely uncertain rather than accusatory, whether I had ever intended to help the family at all. I had thought about how I would answer that question if it was ever asked directly. I had thought about it for longer than she would probably have guessed. I have been helping this family for 11 years, I told her. The difference is that from now on, I will do it on terms that are written down. She did not respond immediately. The silence on the line lasted long enough that I counted it. Then she said she understood, which may or may not have been true, but which was, at minimum, the right answer. 14 months have passed since that Thanksgiving afternoon. My mother signed option A. The written request process is in place, and she has used it once. A modest and properly documented request that was reviewed, agreed to, and fulfilled within the 30-day window the framework specifies. The process worked exactly as it was designed to work. My sister never submitted a written request. Contact between us has been minimal and civil in the particular way that formal distance produces. Polite at the surface, defined by the absence of anything underneath. She elected option B by conduct, which is a choice I documented and which I respect in the same way I respect any decision that is made clearly and held consistently. In the 14 months since my family learned the number, my real estate portfolio has appreciated by an estimated $340,000. I did not do anything to produce that appreciation. The structures I built continued functioning after the dinner table conversation, exactly as they had been functioning before it. Assets held inside correctly designed legal frameworks do not pause to process family conflict. They compound. That is not vindication. It is simply what correctly built things do when you leave them alone. The Federal Reserve's 2022 data places the top 1% wealth threshold at $11.64 million. The Congressional Budget Office found that the top 10% of American families now hold 60% of all national wealth. A peer-reviewed study published in 2017 found that family dynamics shift from altruism toward control when one member accumulates significantly more than others and perceived fairness breaks down. These numbers explain why that Thanksgiving conversation happened. They also explain why versions of it are happening in dining rooms across the country, and will continue to happen, because the conditions that produce them are not unusual. They are structural. My family did not demand my assets because they were malicious. They demanded them because no one had ever built a framework that made the demand impossible to act on. I built that framework. That is the only difference. They called it selfish. I called it architecture. Document your assets, define your terms, build the structure before someone else tries to define it for you. The number shocked them. The paperwork ended the conversation. What you build in silence, you protect in writing.